Thank you everyone to coming. My name is JoJo Platt. I'm a consultant in the field of neurotechnology for the past 16 or so years. And I want to thank IEEE and Future Directions, as well as EMBS, and specifically Paul, Metin, Erica, Sinquin, Julie, Chris, and Kathy, who are here today, who've been working tirelessly in the background to make sure that all of your tech and AV issues don't actually manifest. But if they do, we have some opportunities for you to get help without hopefully getting through the flow of our discussion today. If you have AV issues, please go ahead and use the chat function, and somebody from IEEE will help you out. As regards to questions for content that we're discussing here, if you want to use the Q&A feature for that, we'd appreciate that. We've got moderators working to help that out. And just sort of to get you engaged in how this will flow, I know this is an opportunity that's open to the wider IEEE membership. So we have a variety of attendees today with a range of backgrounds. And our focus today is on the role of neurotechnology in mental health. So we've pulled together some really fascinating speakers for you today. But before I get into exactly who they are, I do want to put just a personal promotion out there for IEEE. It's a great organization if you're here as a visitor, or if there's somebody in your life that you know that could benefit from a membership. I'm sure there's somebody in your life who is struggling mightily at what to get you for a holiday gift, and I would suggest that IEEE membership might be a great opportunity there. With that, I would like to introduce our speakers today. We have Sara Shnider, who is the Chief Scientific Director at OneMind, Steve Goetz, who's the Chief Technology Officer of Motif Neurotech, and Maryam Shanechi, who's the Alexander Sawchuk Chair and Professor of ECE, CS, BME, and Neuroscience at USC, as well as the Director of the USC Center for Neurotechnology. I've pulled these three people together specifically because I think we can address a broad range of topics within the field, or within the question of what is the role of neurotechnology in mental health. I've asked each of the speakers to take just a couple of minutes to let us know what their background might be, and what brings them here today, as well as a little bit of background on their work. And then from there, we'll get into sort of some moderated questions, and then we'll hold the audience Q&A toward the end. I do try and really focus on the audience Q&A because you guys have more interesting questions than I do sometimes. So please feel free to jump in with your questions as they come up. And we'll moderate those from our side. So I'd like to start with Sara Shnider from OneMind.
Thank you so much, JoJo, and thank you so much, the IEEE, for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here and to have this conversation with my amazing colleagues. So I'm Sara Shnider. I'm a science director for OneMind. OneMind is a nonprofit that's focused on catalyzing visionary change through science, business, and media to transform the world's mental health. It was established about 30 years ago by Garen and Sherry Staglin, who established the organization after the schizophrenia diagnosis of their son. And so really the voice of the families and of the lived experience, their son Brandon Staglin plays a executive leadership role at the organization as chief advocacy officer, is really at the forefront of everything we do. So what do? We basically run high impact programs to accelerate research and innovation in mental health through multiple avenues. We have programs that are focused on early career research in academia through a program called the Rising Star Awards, which supports early career scientists doing high-risk, high-reward projects in psychiatry. And these projects can span everything from mechanism of action of psychedelics to how do you use focused ultrasound for neuromodulation to improve treatment for those with depression. And we're very proud of our graduates, including Maryam Shanechi, who's a Rising Star awardee from OneMind. An additional program we have is we really wanted to build a program for having more immediate impact on mental health. And the research is really the foundation, but the time horizons are very long. And so a couple of years ago, we launched an accelerator program to back bold and determined founders in mental health to build category defining companies that can improve lives of people that are facing mental health challenges. This program is a 9-week program that is really ultra customized and with milestone driven programming to help the participants really build their network within the mental health ecosystem and talk to all different stakeholders and really make a huge impact. We've had 21 companies that graduated from the program. We're currently selecting our 3rd cohort. And here too, we're very proud of our graduates. We have Motif Neurotech was in our 1st cohort. So I'm really surrounded by our friends and colleagues from OneMind. About half of the companies are in the biopharma and device space, and half of them are working on innovative care models and how to improve care, access, and reaching diverse populations. The companies in the accelerator have raised over 200 million in the 2 years since we launched the accelerator and impacted the lives of over 800,000 people. And a 3rd program that we run is we really are trying to envision a world where people can have the support and care for their mental health needs in all aspects of their life, including in the workplace. And so we're really designing the future of workplace mental health through a program called OneMind at Work, where we're building a global coalition of leadership that's committed to improving workforce mental health. And so they're building standards and best practices to support human thriving in the workplace. And there's currently 140 companies in this that span healthcare, tech, financial services, but also retail, transportation, and all of them through their leadership are committed to improving mental health in the workplace. And in addition, we have a media arm that's really focused on providing reputable information from our scientists in our community of OneMind, but also providing stigma busting media. So basically just getting rid of the stigma around mental health, having people who are talking about their experience, what it is like to live with some of these challenges, and having dialogue with scientists and leaders in the community. So this is what OneMind is doing. I myself, I'm a PhD in neuroscience. I worked on more of kind of the genetic and molecular mechanisms of development of the neocortex, so less from the neurotech side. But since my PhD, I've been working on commercializing academic innovation in different sectors, so in nonprofit, in academia, and most recently, before I joined OneMind, I was at Teva Pharmaceuticals working on their partnerships with academia to advance translational research towards commercialization. So thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you, Sara. And just I want to make sure that people who might not have made their applications in for the 3rd cohort, what generally speaking, if people are planning or are interested in applying for the next one, what's the application window so that they can put it on their calendars?
Yes, thank you. So we've actually closed applications for this coming cohort, which is going to be launched in February. But basically, it runs from February till the end of April, and then as soon as that is over, then we'll be opening kind of in the few months after that, kind of late summer, we'll open applications, but we're always sourcing companies. So if you have a startup that's in the mental health space, anything from pre-seed all the way to Series A, come talk to us. We're basically always sourcing. But the applications will open in the summer for the following year's cohort.
Great, thanks. And next up, Steve Goetz with Motif Neurotech.
Wonderful. Well, first, I'd like to thank the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. I'll give a little bit of background for myself and a little bit of a background on Motif and what we're up to. So my bulk of my career was at Medtronic, working in and around the neuromodulation space. Had the opportunity to work on very many great therapies in many different domains, specific focus in deep brain stimulation for a variety of disorders. And part of that was kind of exploratory research in mental health and neuropsychiatric applications. And I understood from that both the opportunities of modulating the brain for mental health and also some of the challenges. So about 1.5 years ago, I left Medtronic to come to Motif as Chief Technology Officer to pursue some of those opportunities more directly and do it in maybe a little bit of a different way that hopefully serves some of the challenges with that space a little bit better. And so I'll give just a very brief overview of what Motif is up to. So we are looking at mental health as an electrical network problem in the brain. We know there are great therapies like transcranial magnetic that can target this disorder, but we also know those therapies are very, very hard to access. So our goal is to develop a miniaturized stimulator that allows us to modulate the networks that are known to be implicated in treatment-resistant depression. So specifically, we understand the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, part of the central executive network, connected very strongly to the deep structures that have been traditionally modulated by electrical stimulation. And our goal is to provide this therapy not in a clinic, but in a patient's home to make it much more accessible, and also to unlock some of the opportunities for not just treating a depressive episode, but maintaining that treatment, maintaining that remission over time through the use of novel markers of brain state related to depression, and perhaps some biomarkers related to prediction of relapse. Our device is a miniaturized stimulator, again, trying to address some of those challenges with traditional deep brain stimulation. We are, I will say, brain adjacent, sitting on top of the dura, not actually contacting the brain. So some of the challenges of deep brain stimulation, some of the reasons a patient may not access it, hopefully go away. Hopefully some of the challenges to capacity, so the very specialized functional stereotactic neurosurgeons traditionally required for these interventions, hopefully should not be needed as we approach this as a outpatient procedure targeting that network in the brain from a burr hole in the skull epidurally with delivery of therapy catalyzed through a wearable unit such as a hat here shown in the video. So that's what Motif is up to, looking at treatment-resistant depression as a first indication in mental health, looking at epidural neural stimulation as a hopefully scalable, accessible, safe way to do it, and shifting the point of care from hard to access in-clinic centers to patients' home on a remote dosed as needed basis, and shifting the focus from treat, retreat to treat, prevent.
Fantastic. Thanks, Steve. I think this is a great juxtaposition. We sort of have the commercial ecosphere represented by Sara. Some of the, I won't isolate or won't restrict you to the hardware side, Steve, but I think your solution is hardware driven, which is a perfect segue into Maryam's work, which really explores the networks themselves and how they can be understood and leveraged. So I'll let Maryam go.
So hi, everyone. Thanks, JoJo, and thanks to the IEEE for inviting me and organizing this exciting session. So I'm coming more from the academic side of things. I have a lab at USC and a Center for Neurotechnology where we work on building neurotechnologies that are rooted in engineering principles as well as AI and machine learning. So as we all know, and this session is all about, we are motivated by the fact that their brain disorders are a leading cause of disability worldwide, and unfortunately, in a lot of cases, resistant to standard therapies. Major depression is one of them, as Steve talked about. And there are, therefore, a critical need for alternative therapies. And based on the idea that these disorders are signs of abnormal electrical activity across diverse brain networks, one idea could be to directly decode and regulate these abnormal activity patterns as an alternative way to treating these patients. Now, this regulation could be through any kind of neurostimulation, for example, what Steve talked about, or it could be DBS or deep brain stimulation. Now, what are these kind of brain activity patterns that we need to regulate? I'm showing you intracranial EEG electrodes that are implanted in the brain, and these are the signals that we record from them. So you can see that these signals and brain activity patterns are very complex, they're high dimensional, there's no clear pattern in these signals that would, for example, tell me what a person's depression severity is at a given point in time. So in order to develop these therapies, what we need is to actually build systems that model these complex brain activity patterns, decode from that an underlying brain state. Let's say if you're talking about depression, this could be a mood state or the severity of symptom, and then use that as feedback within a controller that would then adjust and optimize the therapy, for example, DBS, frequency and amplitude, continuously in time in order to take the symptom level to a target healthy level. So this is an example of a closed loop control system. And as engineers, we are very good at designing these systems. For example, think about autopilot. So you may ask me, why is it then that we still cannot do this for the brain and mental disorders? Now, the issue, of course, is that unlike an airplane, we didn't design the brain. It's an extremely complex system of over 80 billion neurons with unknown dynamics. And that introduces a huge AI challenge to build data-driven models of this complex system and to come up with data collection frameworks that can enable such modeling. So that is what my lab is focused on. We work at the interface of AI, control theory, and neuroscience to develop AI-based closed-loop decoding and regulation systems for the brain and enable a new generation of neurotechnologies and brain-computer interfaces that go beyond movement disorders and can actually address mental health conditions. So towards building this closed-loop control system, we've made quite a bit of progress in the past few years. For example, we've shown the first decoding of mood from human intracranial brain activity in each individual over time. We've developed models that can actually predict the effect of electrical stimulation on large-scale brain networks. We've extended AI algorithms to neurotechnology by developing deep learning methods that can actually enable real-time decoding and inference for these closed-loop systems. And recently, we've also developed AI algorithms for joint modeling of neural behavioral data to improve decoding of mental and behavioral states. So at the end of the day, our vision is to develop AI-based systems that not only extract mental states from human brain networks, but also go beyond that and actually regulate these states. And we believe there's a lot of opportunity to work across disciplines and build both hardware and software systems that can move us closer to this vision. So I'm looking forward to discussing with you some of the challenges and opportunities in this domain.
Fantastic. Thanks, Maryam. I think it's very clear that this is an incredible body of work among the three of you. And I think given that we have different perspectives represented by the panelists, we'll sort of tailor some of the questions for each of the speakers. So not everybody will answer every question so that we can get to a broader pool of questions. But with that, I'm going to start with Maryam and Steve. Just a little bit, in terms of the engineering challenges that you face, what are the biggest things that you've encountered that have caused pause or consternation or a lot of head scratching or sleepless nights in each of your endeavors?
So for me, so I'm more on the system side of things, right? So one thing that has been a big challenge, especially in the mental health areas, I come from the motor BCI domain where behaviorally it's very easy to actually measure the behavior you're trying to decode from the brain, like movements are easy to measure. But when you talk about mental health, even behaviorally, how do we measure somebody's depression severity or their mood or their anxiety level? Even behaviorally, there's a huge challenge in terms of how we measure these mental states. And that immediately translates into the difficulty to understand the brain networks that underlie these mental states because we don't have rich enough data. So on that front, we've been working in two major directions. One is to get better data and to extend going beyond just, say, questionnaires to looking at other modalities like audiovisual tracking of mental states or physiological tracking through wearable data. So that just gives us more richer data. But the other direction we're going into is like kind of building on the power of concepts in engineering and AI to deal with the sparsity and noisy nature of the data sets on the behavioral side, be able to build more robust and accurate models of how the brain represents these states. So we're both innovating on the AI front and innovating on the data collection front to kind of tackle this challenge.
Yeah, I'll give a related answer. So the problem of measures shows up in our domain kind of through the lens of clinical studies. And so as we talk to people about designing studies for mental health, questions of gold standard measures come up, but certainly the concerns about sham and placebo. And this is a space, because the measures are, somewhat subjective. It is a space that is heavily influenced by concerns about placebo and appropriate shams. And so as we move forward, it's very hard to do placebo surgery. So we think hard about different clinical trial designs that allow us to show that our effect is real and isn't a placebo response and a subjective measure. And so we're very interested in those kind of data quality and really moving towards objective measures and predictive objective measures rather than trailing subjective measures to design those studies, so that we believe them, so that others believe them, so that ultimately regulators and patients and clinicians believe them. The other thing I'll mention it's a challenge that flows into all aspects of this is just human variability. And so as we think about brain networks, they don't present the same way in every patient. Basic things like anatomy, like finding a target, are challenging, but also, as we know, these therapies impact the brain and the connectivity of the brain and the representation of networks within the brain. What might be your target to start a therapy could change over time, or said a different way, the brain state represented by a symptomatic state in depression may be abnormal in ways that are very, very idiosyncratic to a patient or a particular disease presentation. And so we think about that human variability as we think about targeting, as we think about dosing. It may be the case that the right waveform for one patient is not the right waveform for another patient. And of course, we think about that variability in very basic things like, the anatomy and geometry of a head and a skull and what that affords a specific device design. And so designing for the great variety of human anatomy, both physical anatomy like skull, scalp, curvatures, but also the physiological variation of representation of brain networks, of patient-specific targeting and patient-specific, optimal waveforms for modulation. Those are some of the scientific challenges that turn into technical challenges very, very quickly.
I think that's an interesting point. Several years ago, when companies would come and I'd engage with them, and they'd say, well, we can do one of two targets as our beachhead market. We can do depression, or we can do some other indication that was a little more well understood. And it used to be, I was very frightened because of exactly what you said, was that human variability. But I would add to that a possible risk for trial design and for research is adding to that the comorbidities that are frequently associated with depression. How do each of you sort of address the issue of comorbidities?
Yeah, it is one we're watching very carefully, and it's a challenge as you think about markets, because there's one philosophy that says, craft the largest possible inclusion bucket you have. Your TAM is as big as it can be. The problem is, by doing that, you include a lot of different cohorts of subjects. You have depressed patients, you have depressed, anxious patients, and a whole continuum thereof. And the challenge can be a therapy that is very effective for one of those symptoms might leave patients in a state where their secondary symptom or their comorbidity is still causing them so much distress that your outcomes on a subjective clinical trial scale are poor. And so you've solved depression, but anxiety is now bubbled up, and your scores aren't getting that much better because the patient's still suffering, but they're suffering for a different reason now. And so we've sort of flipped to a view that if we can identify a narrower subset in which we're very, very confident we can have a large effect, that's actually a better business strategy. It may look like a smaller business segment, smaller market segment, but you'd almost always rather prefer a small segment with high efficacy, high outcomes, high predictability, because your studies are cleaner, your trials are cleaner, reimbursement's easier, and then expand from there. Like, so don't leave those comorbid patients behind, but don't let them muddy the waters too much in the early days, so that your results are sort of diluted across that heterogeneous population. So it's influenced how we think about trial inclusion, how we've thought about measures, with the goal of ensuring that we can have really high efficacy, really high predictable response in that cohort of patients that we can identify.
Maryam, do you see differences or where you like might be opportunities in some of the brain activity patterns?
Sorry, Jojo, I think we lost you for a second. What was the question again?
Oh, I was just going to ask for your work, and if you're looking at depression, there are people with depression generally, I shouldn't generalize, will often have other disorders attached to it. Do you see anything in the brain activity or the neural data that leads you to believe we have some opportunities there?
Yeah, so I think there's this whole idea of there are transdiagnostic domain of emotional functioning, that it's not really like these traditional diagnoses of depression versus anxiety perhaps are a little outdated, and we have to think more of a transdiagnostic approach. So for us, again, more thinking about this at the level of brain networks, we are trying to understand disorders of these networks, identify patterns that are abnormal in these networks, and then how we can regulate them. So it could be that somebody has both some level of depression and anxiety, and they often are comorbid. So maybe we can actually identify these networks even in those cases and normalize them. And with regards to heterogeneity, I think the whole concept of building a closed loop system that takes some sort of feedback from brain activity and uses that to guide how we stimulate is something that is critical to address that heterogeneity. And these models that we build really rely on those feedback from the activity patterns in these networks, both as a biomarker, but also as an indicator of response to therapy. Is the patient responding the way we think they are? Can we predict the effect of our therapy on these brain networks so that we can optimize them? So we have like two sets of models we think about. One are decoding and on biomarker models, but there are also models of the effect of therapy on brain networks. And we are hoping to combine these within this closed loop system to kind of address that heterogeneity and also kind of take a more transdiagnostic approach to these issues.
Yeah, those kind of measures, if we had highly predictive measures of candidacy for this therapy or any therapy, that just floats all boats, because you get the right patients to the right therapy. You avoid patients having a surgical intervention or taking a medication or whatever who can't benefit. And I think the challenge is you can have a clinical presentation of symptoms that can be caused by very, very different, sort of dysfunctions in the network. And so if we understand, we flip that around and can cohort by patients by how their brain is working or not working, what fiber tracts are healthy or not healthy, what hyper or hypoactivities are present in different structures, that may be a much more specific way to sort of fingerprint these cohorts and get them to the right indication more quickly. And again, we and others, I think, would much prefer a smaller group that we know can respond to our therapy, that are going to be great candidates, because that gives you strong early evidence, gives you strong reimbursement, and then the opportunity to grow beyond that becomes rich. And that's almost always a better place to start than with a large, poorly identified pool, sort of clinical cohorting based on, subjective measures. that includes, people who can respond and people who can't respond. And that's a tough way to go.
Sara, we'll shift gears a little bit, but staying on the same theme of what are your biggest challenges. So as someone who helps guide technologists to become translators, what are some of the things that you see as coming out of, we have a great idea, we're really pretty confident that we can have an effect, now we want to translate. What are the challenges that you see in this space?
Well, one of the things that I think is really important to have in mind right from the start is that, basically each individual's expertise is, somewhat confined and limited in terms of all the different players in this space. And having a very open mindset towards hearing input from other stakeholders and being humble about what you know versus what other people know is really critical. So, there's certain aspects here that are around the engineering challenges, around the scientific questions, and these can in themselves be really, really exciting, but they're not necessarily the key things towards ultimately making a successful product that'll reach patients. And so it's really important from the get-go to have the perspectives of clinicians who are actually going to be the ones who are either, if it's a surgical procedure, maybe implanting the device, or whether they're going to be prescribing these. It's really important to have input from the lived experience community, people who are actually going to be using those devices. And for one thing, also be sure that you're working on a problem that for the patients is important to be solved. Then there's also understanding the regulatory framework, and then understanding who's going to pay for this and the whole reimbursement topic that Steve mentioned. I mean, if you build a great device that gets approval, but actually there's nobody who's going to pay, then you won't be able to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo the point. Neurotech is a team sport, has to be. Like, you need patients, you need clinicians, you need engineers, you need scientists, you need regulators, all pulling in the same direction. And that's, I think, a thing that makes it hard, but also a thing that makes it really fun, because you get to work with experts in all those domains to, get just a little bit close, a little bit more progress on understanding this complex thing that is the brain.
Yeah, and I think, Steve, I've heard Jacob Robinson, the CEO of Motif, say, always hire for your weaknesses. So be really realistic about what strengths you bring to the table and find the people who can complement your expertise. And just to touch back on what we were talking about earlier around engineering challenges, another aspect about bringing in the lived experience input from very early on is that, particularly with the psychiatric indications, there's also a lot of sensitivities around these devices and what you're putting on your head. And maybe there's like sensitivity to sounds that they make. And if you're not bringing that into the picture right from the start, then you're going to have a device that maybe it makes too much noise and nobody wants to be in the machine or wear it. And so that it's really critical to be having that dialogue with the patients and the lived experience community from the get-go. And in tech, that's a given. You're always looking at your customers and who's the consumer, and do they like your app, and doing all these pilots. And in the neurotech space, sometimes there's a lot of work that goes in before you're ever really looking at that end user.
I've spent a lot more time than I ever thought I would thinking about the design of hats, and how do you make something that looks like a normal hat that doesn't call you out as a medical device user, patient on the subway, whatever. And these things absolutely matter.
So all of these considerations sort of manifest themselves on the form factor or the hardware side. Maryam, who do you think are the most important voices for you to listen to as you're looking at data?
Yes, so I think for us also people with lived experience, because if you are trying to track and record, measure their data I think they really have to have a say in how we measure it. For example, if I gave somebody a questionnaire 10 times a day, I don't think they will appreciate that, right? But so, I mean, I think, and if, for example, each questionnaire takes 10 minutes, they're not going to do it. So for us, a lot of our data collection should be informed by how the patients feel about how challenging or taxing it is to actually allow us to collect the data from them. That's one thing. And then also we have to be very careful about privacy concerns and making sure that data is used responsibly and the neuroethics of things. So we actually, in our projects, have neuroethicists who actually guide us on these issues as well to make sure that we are very cognizant about all of these other issues around modeling data and also collecting data from patients.
Yeah, incredibly. I mean, I think you can't overstate how sensitive these data are and how, potentially concerning interventions are to some of the things that make us the most human. Your emotions, your affect, your interactions with the world, and so we've thought a lot about how do we make sure the patient, the subject, feels in control of that, and there are opportunities, for systems that are automatic that you don't have to think about, but there is something to be said for a system where the patient is taking the action, is in control of their therapy in a way that allows them to have agency there. And it's a tough thing because you balance compliance, you balance a lot of other sticky issues, but we think a lot about ensuring, patients who are benefiting from these therapies feel like they're in control and they can, both on the data side and the therapy side, have that agency over their data, their brain state, their perception and reality of the world.
Yeah, and I think that that's another aspect that is unique to psychiatry in some ways. Like, the discussions around privacy and ethics are coming up around all the brain computer interfaces and different ways that we're collecting data from brain. But if you're looking at if you're looking at a BCI that's around motor control and the data that you have is somebody's thoughts about moving a cursor, it's really different than the data you have is around emotional responses to images, memories, and it can also, it's also can enter the domain of implicating people in self-incriminating for past events. This is something that Nita Farahani talks a lot about in The Battle for Your Brain. It really, when it comes to the psychiatry and emotional states, it's like even more sensitive.
Yeah. I mean, I spent many years working on Parkinson's disease, and it is true that there's no amount of tremor that is acceptable, right? So your goal is to make tremor go away. In mental health, something like depression, it is not true that our job is to make all sadness go away, right? Part of human experience is the ability to feel emotions. And so finding that set point on what's a depressive episode, what is pathology, and what is normal human experience is a lot harder than in something like Parkinson's or something like epilepsy. The right number of seizures is 0. Nobody's going to argue with that. The right amount of response to, a scary or sad event, and that's a hard set point to understand.
I think if you negated all depressive states across the continuum, you'd put country music out of business. Just
yeah, right. The bars and taverns would be out of business. I mean, there's a good science fiction movie to be made there. Think of a dystopia from too much utopia.
So we have some really great audience Q&A, and I want to make sure to get to those. But for the including lived experience feedback and creating ethical, having, Maryam, as you said, ethicists involved in the work that you do. A lot of folks on this stream, this is not a normal consideration for them, and I think it's an opportunity that we missed in the social media development, and that I'm very proud of our space for factoring in from the beginning. But how do each of you connect with, reach out, and engage with ethicists and or lived experience members?
So for me, I actually collaborate with ethicists. So if I write a grant, I will have dedicated effort for a neuroethicist to actually conduct interviews, for example, with our patient, to engage them in how they feel and how they view the modalities of data and what we are doing with their data and get their feedback. And we actually plan to explicitly incorporate their feedback into our experimental and scientific designs. So we actually do a very like real integration of neuroethics in our work. So in a recent project that we started, for example, we are doing that. So that then and then because these neuroethicists are actually interviewing the people or subject to these technologies, that is how we take into account the people with lived experience into our again experimental design and technology innovations.
Yeah, I'll react as well. I'll give a shout out to one of our team members, John Nelson, who is an individual very active in the space, who has benefited from these interventions himself, has joined our team to help us kind of organize the lived experience advisory board. So we're trying to go to people with this disorder in all different stages, who've had interventions, who haven't had interventions, understand what needs to be true for this new intervention to be a win for them. And so it's something we take very seriously, to the point of hiring John as our director of lived experience. But it's an evergreen task. You learn as you advance, you share new technologies with them, new approaches, clinical trial design details. There are so many learnings on so many fronts that we've set that up as an ongoing activity. We give them prototypes of hardware, just really try to understand that the thing we're building is meeting the needs that they have today or the needs they think they'll have tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think Motif is really kind of a beacon to other companies in that sense of basically having a lived experience director on your on your leadership team, and having it, it's an employee. It's not like a volunteer that's getting paid, whatever, $150 to come and sleep overnight in a lab. It's not somebody that's just being recruited to participate in a clinical trial and as a vehicle for you to get data, but they're actually sitting at the table and really, critical in the decision-making process. And I think Motif has really been a role model in that sense. We also, I guess because of the history of the organization, we've had kind of the voice of lived experience, at least in the schizophrenia realm, at the table since the beginning, kind of helping shape our priorities. But we've really scaled it up over the last year by building a lived experience council. Currently, we have 4 members, including John Nelson, who's really fantastic. These are all people who are really, in addition to being advocates for mental health and mental health research, they're really, really brave because they're dealing with coming out in the open in an area where there's so much stigma, and they're willing to talk about their experience and put it out there. And it's funny because we did have a meeting recently that was supposedly a scientific meeting, and there was one person there who was a representative of the lived experience community. And somebody said, "Oh, I didn't know there was anybody with lived experience in the room." And everybody laughed because everybody knows that there's people in the room who have lived experience who aren't sharing it, who are still keeping it private. And it's not really, there's only one. There's only one who's willing to put it on their website and talk about it publicly. So it really is an incredible group of people. And we built this council to help advise pretty much all of our programs and have the lived experience community at the table shaping our programs. So certainly for the accelerator, they've been meeting with companies and providing feedback for individual companies. We also bring them into discussions with our Rising Star awardees and with our scientists coming in from industry and academia when we have convenings of multiple stakeholders to be a voice at the table about, what are the priorities for research and how should lived experience voice be integrated throughout their R&D continuum. And so, we really see this as integral. And there's a trend towards that's, it's starting to happen. Like, for instance, the Lancet Psychiatry is now requiring for publications that involve any clinical work to report on how people with lived experience have been integrated into the design and planning of the study. And so it's becoming more, clear that this is really should just be standard. One thing to note, though, is everybody, because of this heterogeneity and diversity of both of indications and of how it manifests in different people, we're still just listening to a few voices with our lived experience council, and we really, want to see that expanded, both in terms of diversity of indications, but also diversity of kind of backgrounds and lived experience, because talking to one person who's living with schizophrenia doesn't give you the voice of everybody. Yeah, we would love to see this as an integral part, not just starting in companies, but also in research. What we find is many of the basic researchers who are working on the animal models to test different mechanisms and different circuits that are involved in these disorders have never interacted with anybody living with the disorder. And it completely changes your frame of reference for, what is impactful research? What are the symptoms that are really, key to the disorder that impact people's day-to-day life? So we definitely are making a push to having that voice at the table, also with our early stage, the work that we're doing with our early career investigators within academia.
I think I'm going to encourage our panelists, if you want to pull up the Q&A so that we can just kind of take these in order and I don't throw any curveballs at you. We're going to start with a question from William Tonti. Thank you, William. Is it possible to use the advancements in neuromorphic or quantum computing to create a quote unquote brain testbed for system analysis? It feels like a question to start with, Maryam. Not being an engineer, I'm just throwing that out there.
Neuromorphic quantum. So maybe if I understand this correctly, they're talking about potentially developing a simulation testbed that mimics the brain such that we can then better test our therapies in silico before we actually go into human testing. And if that is the case, I don't know about quantum computing, but definitely neuromorphic computing or developing deep learning and AI architectures that aim to mimic the way the brain does computation can potentially allow us to develop brain test beds. And that way, we don't have to go to animal or human testing. We can develop some of our technologies, especially on the modeling side, test them with this brain test bed, and then translate it into actual experiment.
Great. And I think this next question has actually is applicable to everybody, is that their chemistry has clearly been demonstrated as an available tool to control mood, and are traditional medications, chemical solutions, where are the benefits and drawbacks to that versus a stimulation paradigm or blocking, if that's the case?
Yeah, I don't think it's a question of better or worse. I think it's a question of different strengths and weaknesses. Chemicals, certainly orally taken, tend to have systemic effects. So if you want to have a very broad effect, that's a good approach. The consequence of that is they can have systemic side effects. And so the idea of specificity or very targeted responses can be tricky. Electrical, on the other hand, you have a very strong local effect where you put this. You have some ability to have a systemic effect through a network, but they tend to be very precise, very, very selective, very specific, very controllable. So on the pulse to pulse or minute to minute, day to day basis, a lot more opportunity for closed loop or adaptive as the brain changes. And so there's just different pros and cons. Of course, electrical stimulation also often comes with some level of burden, whether that's surgical invasiveness or wearable or something you have to do outside of the clinic. That's generally harder than taking a medication. So I don't know. They're different interventions. They work on different scales. They have different pros and cons with respect to selectivity, specificity, side effects, but also burden. And I think the answer is probably both. There's going to be applications where the strengths of electrical win. There's going to be applications where the strengths of traditional medications win. And there's probably a lot of applications where a patient is going to benefit from aspects of both.
Yeah, and I'd also like to add on to that, that this comes to like getting in input really early. If you think of kind of what the traditional path is for getting care, a lot of psychiatrists are very much more attuned to psychopharmacology and to prescribing medications. And so when you're developing a new device, you need to be really aware that you're competing with what is like the cheap and easy medications to start with, right? And a lot of the antidepressants, for instance, they're generic. You're talking about, you know, maybe $20 a month, or even less, right? And so uh, can your device offer something that is really advantageous over the easiest solution, which is to prescribe, you know, generic medicine the patient can take at home. It's really kind of built into the current care model. It's really easy in terms of just sort of the natural flow of care. And you need to make something that is, you know, as easy as possible to use, that the doctors also like, and they're going to be willing to prescribe instead of a medication. What often happens for a lot of people with, for instance, depression, is that they have to go through a process of trial and error with every single pharmacological intervention, and only after maybe a year, when all of those fail, then they get to go to, let's say, TMS or some of the
Yeah.
you know, the technological interventions. And so it's really something to keep in mind, that that's what you're competing against, the small pill that's going to cost,
Yeah.
you know, very little.
Well, I'll highlight that. I mean, it's sort of in the title, but our target is treatment resistant, which means patients have failed medications. So for our particular population, medications didn't work, aren't an option, had side effects that weren't tolerable, you know, something. And so we'll start there. You know, we certainly aspire to a day where, you know, patients might avoid that year of trial and error and jump right to it with appropriate cohorting. Like if we can predict who's going to not respond to medications and get them to the right therapy, the right interventional therapy quickly, that's a win for everybody. But we're not, you know, we're not quite there yet.
We have about 5 minutes left, so we're not gonna get to all the questions. So as we're kind of going through these, panelists, if you want to jump in and type an answer to somebody's question, Steve, I see some are directed at you specifically. Please feel free to do that. But I'll go ahead and start with, and again, this one's probably a Maryam question. How are you addressing biases in AI modeling algorithms, especially for vulnerable populations or individuals?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So from our point of view, so we are actually building models of brain data and data sets that we collect. So as long as we can keep our population pool balanced and make sure that there's representation across all ethnicities and races and genders, and then we are hoping that we have a rich enough data pool that we can avoid biases, and then you can also compare across different subpopulations to make sure that your models generalize well. So we do this through, as much as possible. Of course, we're working with invasive brain data, so a lot of this is not really in our control, but as much as possible, we try to expand our population pool and diversify it so that we can build models that are agnostic and unbiased.
That's got to be a huge challenge, because it's not just a race or ethnicity question. There's a lot of cultural inputs that make people more resistant to self-reporting or engaging or even seeking help to begin with, let alone getting to a level of intervention that makes data available for you on each of your.
And that's another point that we work with the neuroethicists on as well, in terms of cultural norms and so on. So yeah, these are huge challenges. And again, because a lot of these data are invasive brain data, it's very difficult to just go and try to diversify it. But as much as possible, we try to do so and work with the neuroethicists to address any kind of bias that may exist.
Thank you.
Yeah, and one of the companies in our accelerator called Ellipsis is designing voice biomarkers for diagnosing and triaging people with depression. And in their case, one of the ways that they're addressing this issue around you know, inclusivity and diversity of representation of you know, different populations within their pool is you know, part of what they're doing is they're building natural language processing models and acoustic models, but they're bringing in recordings across wide variety of age groups and cultural backgrounds. And they built the models based on a database of over 10,000 recordings of different voices of people who are either living with depression or not. And so in their case, they're able to basically create a data set that is really diverse, so that the models are being built around inclusive and diverse data sets.
Thanks. And we do have a comment in here that's again from William, that the IEEE has a data repository called IEEE Dataport. There's a link to it in the Q&A section, so if you want to check that out, I'll leave that up as unanswered so that you can get the link. And just to close us out, because we are at time, and I appreciate everybody spending a Thursday morning with us or lunchtime. We're wrapping up the year, and let's be honest, there's not a ton of time left for work between now and the end of the year and the holidays. What is it that each of you are looking forward to tackling most in 25?
I'll give a quick answer. So we are knee deep in developing our first in human system. That work should complete in 2025. We should be at a place to start making requests for regulatory approval, IDE approvals. And so our big 2025 goal is to be ready for a study start in 2026. So it should be a fun year technically, scientifically, and from a regulatory perspective.
That's great. I think that from my perspective, we're just about wrapping up our selection of our next cohort. And then in end of February, we're going to be launching our third cohort of the accelerator. I'm really looking forward to working with these really passionate and talented entrepreneurs, and also looking forward to announcing the cohort pretty soon.
Yeah, from my end, I guess things don't happen drastically differently in academia, but we're very excited about some of the architectures that we've developed, and we're going to, for the first time, apply them to intracranial recordings with mood-related questionnaire data and see if we can make more progress on biomarkers. So that would hopefully happen in the spring sometime.
We're right at 10 o'clock. I pride myself on being on time. So I will just close out by saying thank you all for being here. And please reach out. I don't know about reach out, but at least follow Maryam, Steve, and Sara on LinkedIn, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever your social media platform of choice is. And have a wonderful afternoon.